Hello, everybody. My name is 𝗧𝗿𝗂𝗺. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today with us is again, and we're lucky to have 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗃 with us, is exactly 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗃, 𝗃𝗏. We will discuss markets and, of course, the arrival of the king in town. Louis, what do you think? What does it mean? What it means for the markets, for you, for geopolitics, for everything, for the economy? What Trump is about to do, all those tariffs, the end of U.S. primacy, apparently. Or maybe let me rephrase it like that. The question will be twofold. Apparently, by what Trump is saying, he's not happy with the U.S. primacy that has been with us since the end of the Cold War. And the most important part of it seemed to be an open trade system that maybe was being modified here and there. There are some tariffs there, but basically he seems to want to change it. And first of all, do you concur with this opinion that he will change it and we will have a new system? What do markets say about it? What people, from your kind of domain say about it? And the second thing is whether really the United States could really pull it off. And then later I'll ask you about the internal problems of the US and what do markets say about it? What do you think about it, and so on and so forth?
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to catch up, and it's good to see you. But look, the simplest answer to your question is that obviously I don't know the answers. I wish I did, because if I did, there'd be a lot of money to be made. But who 2 weeks ago would have bet on Trump beating up on Denmark of all places? It's always a bit uncertain what President Trump will do. Or if you go back to his first term, he won election on the promise that he would launch a big trade war against China. And then he came in and shifted from a trade war to a tech war. Instead of telling China, look, you got to buy more from us, he said, you're not allowed to buy our semiconductors anymore, and nobody's allowed to sell high-end semiconductor equipment or semiconductors to China. So, and something he completely had never talked about during the campaign. So I highlight this because I think if you try to make forecasts or predictions on what Trump will do, you can end up with eggs on your face pretty quickly. I think as investors, I like to say that we're paid to adapt more than forecast. And this is especially true with President Trump. Now, having said all this, you mentioned, okay, we're going to do all these tariffs. This is obviously, the $100 billion question. I would highlight one thing. I would highlight that the investment environment in the U.S. today, the economic environment in the U.S. today, is dramatically different than in his first term. In his first term, the big buzzword of the day was deflation. Everybody was worried about deflation. Central bankers kept talking about it. And therefore, there wasn't much economic downside in either protectionism or frankly, running big budget deficits. Because when you're in a deflationary environment, you have a lot more rope to hang yourself with. Fast forward to today, and I think Trump knows deep down that the reason he got reelected was first and foremost because of inflation. Now, this isn't to say that Kamala Harris was a good candidate; she was a terrible candidate. And this isn't to say that the policies proposed by Kamala Harris were great policies that were terrible. I think there were a number of reasons, but when you go through the data, what you find, so you had a 16% swing from Democrats to Republicans amongst voters who earn less than $50,000. And those voters said their primary issue was inflation. Now, I think Trump knows this. I think the one thing Trump is very good at is feeling the popular pulse. And so, he's much more pigeonholed than he was 8 years ago. Because obviously, you can come in and you can put in huge tariffs and you can be very protectionist. But if you do, you clearly risk a reacceleration in inflation. And if he gets a reacceleration in inflation in 2 years' time, he's going to lose the midterms, and then you're going to have the Democrats controlling the House, possibly the Senate, and then he's back to being impeached and, going through that whole rigmarole, which I'm sure he'd rather avoid. So, you look at economically, the United States is perhaps not in as healthy a place as it was, just 4 or 8 years ago. And so protectionism is now a much more dangerous policy than it used to be.
Yeah, but still, accepting what you have just said, still the main hallmark of the entire camp, Vance, Vice President Trump himself, was this claim that the world simply robbed United States. Even, Canada was accused recently of robbing the United States.
Those evil Canadians.
Exactly. Lurking from the north against the
Yes,
interest.
that's right.
That he wants to reshape the trade system of the world, which
Yeah.
has been the hallmark of the open first Bretton Woods and then post Bretton Woods system, where the U.S. primacy was being exercised. Yeah.
So look, I think on this, the real debate is a pretty simple one, and we'll know the answer soon enough. But the real debate is for Trump, for the people in his administration, are the tariffs a tool for, a greater goal, or are they the goal in themselves? Now, I think when you look at the people around Trump, if you look at somebody like J.D. Vance, tariffs are probably the end goal, because what you want is to try to reindustrialize the U.S. and that involves some short-term pain, but you've got to take it, etc. This is very much the economic mantra of somebody like Robert Lighthizer, who was, part of the Trump inner sanctum. But then you listen to guys like Elon Musk and guys like Scott Bessent, the incoming Treasury Secretary, and for them, tariffs are a means to an end. You use the threat of tariffs to get something out of the other country. Now, you just mentioned Canada, Mexico. These were the first countries that Trump threatened with extra tariffs. Now, interestingly, his point was, look, you guys aren't doing enough to control your border. You're not doing enough to control the flow of fentanyl and other dangerous drugs into the U.S. Therefore, I'm going to tariff you. So it was, in his first tariff pronouncements, he makes it sound as if you're using tariffs as a mean to a greater goal. The goal is controlling the border, stopping the illegal immigration, stopping the drug trade. And Mexico and Canada, you got to get on board with this. So, I still think that most of the people in key economic positions in the Trump administration are more of the latter kind. They're more of, let's use tariffs as a goal rather than them being a goal in themselves. But you're absolutely right. You just mentioned it. J.D. Vance is a clear departure from this. J.D. Vance, I think for somebody like J.D. Vance, the tariffs are the goal in themselves. Reindustrialization is the goal. But interestingly, I think, since the election, you haven't heard much from J.D. Vance. He's not been as much in media and in the public eye as, say, an Elon Musk or even a Scott Bessent.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think? What is the reason for that?
I think because deep down, Trump knows that if he goes down the path of the tariffs, the J.D. Vance, the Robert Lighthizer way of, look, we take the pain, we suffer for 3 or 4 years, and on the other side, we're better for it. He's only here for 4 years. He's here for a good time, not a long time. Maybe if he had, 8 years ahead of him, he would think, okay, we'll take the tough medicine up front and we'll reap the rewards down the road. But, what in his career or in his life or in his, anything that he's ever done, leads us to believe that Trump is the kind of guy who takes the medicine up front, who is going to do a hard diet because on the other side, something is better. That's not really his MO. He's more of an, he's a president for this age of instant gratification. That's been his whole life, and I don't think you change your stripes at 79 years old.
Interesting. Maybe the next question will be very hard then.
Go for it.
Given the ailings of the U.S. system that are apparent, and Trump was selected to address them. What would you do if you were the Trump to heal those problems, Louis?
So I think, I'm, one of my favorite commentators, a guy called Jim Grant. He's one of the best writers of the English language. He writes a lot about central banks, and he was asked, if you became Fed director, what would you do on day one? And he said, resign. And so, it's a tough job, but I think there's, you can look at politicians, they identify a problem. And Trump, I think, has been very good at identifying the problems, all the social problems linked to deindustrialization in the United States, identifying, the hollowed out communities, et cetera, et cetera. So he puts a spotlight on that. Now, the solution is indeed, okay, we need to reindustrialize the United States, but this is very, very hard to do because first you don't have the 40, 50-year-old workers to train the 20-year-old workers because your labor force doesn't want actually industrial jobs. Only a small part of it wants industrial jobs, so on and so forth.
Louis, let's pause with this one. Let's try to, do it one by one because this is the challenge is enormous.
Yeah.
Not only do you have this, but also there is an internal debate within this Trump's camp between, guys like Obama and Elon Musk, whether they should import engineers and people with talent. So because, Americans are the best. No, it's not necessarily so. And here we go with this concept of, shining down the hill, which is the best. And for sure, the Americans are the best. So,
So no, look, on this, I think you identify the problem and then you think, okay, I got to try to solve the problem. Now, if you're a politician and you're like, okay, I can't solve this problem, the next best thing you can do is try to be seen to be solving the problem. You might not solve it, but you want to be seen to be solving it. And so when it comes to industrialization of the United States, what is Trump going to do? He's going to force China to open a few factories in the U.S. He's going to say, look, unless BYD opens a factory in Michigan and Li Autos open a factory in Tennessee and Long Hill Machinery opens a factory in Ohio, I'm going to tariff the hell out of you. And China will be very happy to give in. They want to build factories in the U.S. And so Trump will be able to, go to the BYD factory opening and cut the ribbon and, pat himself on the back. Now, in terms of moving the needle, it will do very little. There'll be 10,000 jobs here, 10,000 jobs here. In terms of the whole U.S. economy, it won't be that important. But in terms of political points and political positioning, it will allow him to say, look, I'm solving the problem that nobody else cared about. And at the margin, it will improve a little bit. And so, perhaps that will win. Now, granted, to your point, I think the whole debate about, let's bring in a bunch of Indian engineers because they're cheaper and they're better. This all of a sudden, I think that was a mistake, in essence, by the people around Trump, by Elon Musk and others, and Vivek Ramaswamy, to put this on the table because all of a sudden the media focused on this and this clearly split the right. Personally, this was like the media story for a week. And then all of a sudden, Trump started to say, okay, I'm going to take over Greenland and I'm going to take over Canada and I'm going to take over Panama. It was a typical Trump thing. It's like, don't look over here, look over here. And now all of a sudden, everybody's talking about Greenland and everybody's talking about Canada. And nobody's talking about the H-1B visas anymore. And nobody's talking about that issue of importing more labor because deep down, that is a big, big problem. Indeed, if they do that in size, that will upset the base. Now, what's going to happen? They're going to do it anyway. It's just they're going to do it discreetly. they're going to do what they've always done, which is import more H-1B visas. Do you really think that, Tesla is going to run out of engineers? No. Neither is Microsoft and neither is Google. When these guys want engineers, they'll be given engineers. Um, and but it'll be done without, in a big media uh, massive show. It'll just be done quietly. And when you open a factory for BYD, that will be done with massive media coverage. It's just, it's just the way it works.
Maybe to the contrary, maybe they will impose additional protectionist measures, for example, against Europe, that will supposed to be increase the import of human talent into the United States, and it will be regarded by the Europeans as the picking up the best of the best in Europe, and that will be part of the all this sanctioning tariffs and.
It could. I mean, that's a possibility. Look, I think what you're going to see is all the Europeans are going to be told, the Audis and the VWs, they're going to be told, look, from now on, you want to sell cars here, you produce them here. No more shipping cars from Europe. And yeah, yeah. So now, so you're going to have, and the Japanese are going to be told the same, and the Chinese are going to be told, you're welcome to produce cars here and sell them here. Because cars is something that is so visible. You see them down the street, etc. That, that's just the way that market will go. And so, yes. Now, what will probably happen, to your point, is Mercedes or BMW will say, okay, sure, we'll produce here, but we need to send our engineers over, and we need to send our quality control managers. And, those guys will be given visas for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the second leg of this reform. Where will the Americans take the capital goods that are required to industrialize when they don't manufacture them anymore? And
yeah,
they want to impose tariffs on those who manufacture them. So how will that play out?
Yeah, no, I know. When you start pulling on the string, it makes less and less sense. And yes, today, who are the big makers of capital goods? It is China, it is Japan, to a lesser extent, it's Germany. So when BYD, when they say, okay, BYD, you have to open a factory here, BYD will say, well, okay, sure, we need to import all these machines that, from China. So we'll commit to hiring, I don't know, 30,000 people, and I'm picking a number out of thin air. We'll commit to employ 30,000 people, but obviously you got to let our machines through. So look, I don't know how the trade deal is going to end up working. What I do know is that Trump can't afford, or sorry, the U.S. economy can't afford a massive protectionist wave, or if he does do a massive protectionist wave, he's going to have a big backlash at the polls because the inflation will pick up and it'll be deeply, deeply unpopular.
And that brings me to a very philosophical question, given this U.S.-China rift, given Trump presenting himself as a really imperator, imposing on other nations. What is the nature of power? I mean, where is the real power in the world? And the question is, what is it in movable capital, like I print US dollars, so I have the power and I have a control over the financial system, so I say what is good and what is wrong? Or it's in the real production and control of critical supply chains, raw minerals, food production, and where's the power? Because apparently it's not GDP anymore in terms of just on paper. But what do you think? And I'm asking you from the depth of your whole life experience. I'm sure you've been thinking about it, not as a investor or someone who talks about markets, but as a human being. So where's the power, you think?
I'm sure the golden rule. The golden rule is that he who has the gold makes the rules. Now, the interesting question looking ahead is, you look at China and other emerging markets, including Russia, they're accumulating gold as fast as they can. And gold keeps leaving the United States. Now, today, we have lived in a US dollar system for the past 70 years. And so living in a global US dollar system, the US dollar made the rules, i.e. the US made the rules. And this financial power, I think, of the United States is still with us and it's still there. But I tend to think it's being eroded every day. Now, you could say, well, how could it be? The US dollar is strong and the US equity market is strong. But I think you're starting to see the first cracks in the US bond market, which is the very bedrock of financial markets because everything is priced off of bonds at the end of the day. The US bond market is definitely cracking as we speak. You've had the Fed cut interest rates in the fourth quarter of last year. They cut it by 1%, 100 basis points. And usually when the Fed cuts, long-term interest rates on bonds, long-term interest rates go down and bond prices go up. This time around, the exact opposite happened. The Fed started to cut and the bonds sold off. So we're now in an environment where the bond market is starting to tell you, hold on, something's not quite right in the US. Now, for now, you've got the bond market saying something's not quite right in the US, and the equity market saying, dude, you're lame, party on. And so now at some point, if and when the equity markets start to worry as well, and start to worry simply because, the bonds sell off every day, when the equity markets start to sell off, then I think the US will start looking a whole lot more vulnerable. Now, long-winded answer to your question, look, we've lived in a unipolar world for 30 years, for most of your and my adult life. And the reality is we're gradually moving to a world that's multipolar with lots of different centers of power. China today is more powerful than it was 10 years ago. It's more powerful than it was 20 years ago. And when you look at China's dominance of industry after industry, I would say that in 10 years' time, China will be more powerful still. So, yeah.
You think you basically you think so, just let's cut off all those data that, in conversations with other, outlets, you don't keep providing as being really a superb knowledge holder, let me put it that way. But just to cut long story short, you think the United States, because all this Trump's talking is about stopping China at the end of the day. Even Biden's last speeches were all about stopping China somehow.
Absolutely. And look, that's been the rhetoric for 8 years, right? For the past 8 years, it's been let's stop China. Now, when they started all this anti-China rhetoric 8 years ago, China's trade surplus was $250 billion a year. You're now at $1 trillion. If 5 years ago we had this conversation and I had said, look, by 2024, China will be the biggest auto exporter in the world, you would have laughed. Like that idea 4 or 5 years ago would have seemed laughable. Now, the reality is you take pretty much any industry, solar panels, nuclear plants, railroads, machine tools, industrial robots. China's now the world leader. And it's the world leader not only because it produces goods that are cheaper, but very often that are now of higher quality. Like Chinese cars are now better than Western cars. Did you know that Audi in China, which was the first Western brand in China to be sold, Audi has actually dropped their logo for China, the four. So because now it's perceived as being an impediment in China to be a European brand. If you're a European brand, like Chinese consumers view you as being inferior to a Chinese brand. So things have been turned completely on their head in just a few years. And I think most people have missed that because nobody's visited China in the past 5 years because of COVID, because of China siding with Russia, because everybody deciding China was uninvestable. Nobody's visited China. And what's happened, the story of China of the past 7, 8 years, so the government told the banks, look, stop lending to real estate and just lend to industry from now on. And 7 or 8 years later, we suddenly wake up to the reality of a China that basically dominates every single industry.
And here comes my next question, and that will be again a question about nature of the political power being capable of imposing on the capital within the country, and that's a huge difference between US and China, and maybe that's why
Absolutely.
we will not make it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but according to my understanding of how the economy works and the political system in China, apparently at some point, some years ago, Xi Jinping noticed that they will need to switch to the more high margin, high yield production in order to change this kind of a system when they are simply dependent on the Western economies.
Yes.
And he had to come over to all those bosses of the Communist Party who were making billions and being simply, producing cheap toys, cheap phones, all those cheap electronics and other things, and tell them, listen, guys, you've got 10 Rolls Royces, you're very rich, but now cut this, cut this S, because bullshit.
Cut it out.
And you need to invest all the yields, not in, the same factory, or you need to invest in R&D, and you will be producing cars, you will be doing AI, and you will be flying into, space. Understand? And if not, the corruption, campaign, will be launched. And this is how the political system is imposing on the, capitalists within the system. Was it the case? Louis, what do you think?
No, it's a bit different. It's a bit different. The way China works is it's sort of like that, but a bit different. So let me explain now how I think it works.
Let me finish. It would be undoable in the Western system when there is a political balance between capital holders,
of course,
and the political system. You can't force them to resign from yields and short-term profits. Yeah, okay.
So the way it works in China is Xi Jinping at the top says, you know what, we need to be leaders in electric vehicles. So he says that 10 years ago. It's electric vehicles of the future. So now imagine that you're, a provincial governor or a mayor of a big town or a party secretary of a region. So you basically had your marching orders. What you know is that essentially your ability to get the next job, to get the bigger job, depends now on your ability to show Xi Jinping that you can produce electric cars. So what you do is you pick up your phone and you call your local bank and you say, hey, bank, you need to lend money to my local car producer so that he can start producing electric vehicles. And before you know it, you have literally 130, that's the number today, 130 companies producing electric vehicles in China. All very well funded by the banks. And this is when what I like to call the Hunger Games of capitalism starts. You got 130 guys who are going at each other's throats, knowing that maybe only 5 will survive. So it's literally the Hunger Games. Now, the big winner of that Hunger Games is the consumer. He gets to have a better car at a cheaper price. Because, the only guys who survive produce the best car at the cheaper price. So it is like a super, super competitive environment. So it's very different. In the Western world, we say, okay, we want to produce electric cars, so we're going to give subsidies to consumers to buy an electric car, and eventually Elon Musk becomes a multi-billionaire, and that's how we do it in the Western world. In China, that you just let them go at each other's throats. Now, the end loser, you could say, are the banks. The banks who, do all these, lend. 5 of them will survive, 125 will go down, and that leaves the banks with the bad loans. And that's why every 5 to 10 years, the banks need to be recapitalized. And essentially, the government ends up very often, taking all this bad debt. You create bad debt structures, bad debt asset management companies. You put the bad debt in there, and it ends up getting back on the government balance sheet. So this is how China works, which is, an environment where the competition levels is like nothing we know and experience in the West.
I understand, but in order to achieve this, you need to have the financial system, the banks.
Yep.
That
you need to have capital controls. You need to have capital controls.
Yes, and that are serving the economy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
they
you need to have capital controls, and you need to have a high savings rate, which you have both of these things in China. So people save a lot, and they end up leaving their money at the bank because if you put it in equities, you're participating in the Hunger Games essentially. And who wants to do that? So the money stays at the bank. The banks have lots of money to lend, and because of capital controls, the money doesn't flee.
Okay, Louis. So now the question that you have heard 1,435 times. So I understand that the catastrophe in China is around the corner, and we are waiting for it because again, and again, every week I read those gloomy predictions that structural problems in China are like paramount, and every politician in the US, all newspapers claim again that there is a new one. I stopped reading it. What do you think about that now? Has anything changed, or this is the same, the same lines all over the time?
Well, look, I think there's many different disaster stories for China. Obviously, the one that everybody was worried about was that, 7, 8 years ago, when the U.S. unleashed the tech war on China, and China decided, okay, my response to this is I'm telling the banks no more loans to real estate and only lend to industry because I have to shelter my economy from potential attacks from the U.S. Um, then when you had that, real estate went down. Now everybody thought, oh, I've seen this movie before. This is like Japan in the 90s, or this is like the US in 2008. But it wasn't. So you had a big real estate bust, and now that's probably coming to an end. It looks like, a lot of the data is bottoming out. And meanwhile, you've had an industrial boom of epic proportion. Now, you know, when people tell you China's imploding, I think there's a few key stats because GDP only tells you so much of a story. It's you're also comparing apples and oranges. I'll give you a simple example. In the U.S., 18% of GDP is healthcare. In China, it's 5. But meanwhile, in China, you now have a higher life expectancy than you do in the U.S. and a lower infant mortality. So China spends, you know, less than a third of what the US spends as a percentage of GDP and ends up with better outcomes. So, would it be better off if it spent 3 times as much and if healthcare was unaffordable like in the US? I'm not sure. But here's some important numbers. Today China China produces about twice as much electricity as the US. Now, yeah, I think we've discussed this before, but I tend to believe that economic activity is energy transformed. So, the fact that the China produces twice as much electricity, I think that's an important number. It's China produces 13 times the amount of steel that the US produces 22 times the amount of cement. Um, for every one ship that the US produces, China produces 100. Um, if you look at cars, China produced 30 million cars last year, and the US produced roughly 10 million cars. So China produces roughly 3 times as many cars. Out of the 30 million that China produces, 26 were sold in China, 4 were exported. In the US, and it's like number after number. China basically every year buys roughly 3 times the number of smartphones than the US. Um, so, you know, on any matrix that's like hardcore that you can touch, China's already massively outpacing the US. The reason the US still has a bigger GDP is because the healthcare spending is much higher because spending of lawyers, spending on a lot of services. But yeah, so
From
just
what
highlighting this.
it stems
So
from.
all this to say the Chinese economy to me today doesn't look like it's imploding.
Yes, it stems from what you're saying over years, actually, because you've been, of the same opinion since I started listening to you. What is a real miracle that not only about the growth of China, rise of China, but given the international, competition theory, since the inception of capitalism 500 years ago, every single century there was a systemic war between the rising power and declining power about the edifice of capitalism, who makes better profits and who controls the main floors and the main rooms in this edifice of capitalism. And this would be the first time ever that China managed or is managing to navigate this rocky waters without the kinetic war being initiated against it, or without it initiating it, navigating here and there, and it has.
I'm hopeful.
It has
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that will be the case, because let's face it, if there's a war between China and the US, a real war, that's a war that destroys the world. I mean, they're both nuclear powers.
Yeah.
Now, if they weren't both nuclear powers, maybe there would be that war.
Yes,
but
some nuclear powers should get the Nobel Prize for peace, basically.
Yeah.
And that brings me to maybe one of the last questions during our conversation today, is back to our, native Europe, let me put it that way. Yeah. So given what you have just said, given the changing nature of the US system and the new king and the tariffs maybe that he will be imposing, isn't it so that the Western leaders, especially in Western Europe, given the tensions that they face, no access to Russian energy, increasing demands on decoupling from United States, now even tariffs potential will be imposed, wouldn't they move towards the major trade deal with China? And
so first I would,
the transatlantic.
You might have seen me smile when you said European leaders, because I would answer what leaders. I think, for the past 10 years, the US decided to essentially start a Cold War with China. And that, I think, opened up a huge opportunity for Europe. It opened up a huge opportunity to say, look, I'll be the go-between, I'll be the bridge between the US and China. I'll be a power in my own right, and I'll make my own decision dependent on what's good for my own people and my own economy. And instead of doing that, we just acted as lapdogs of the United States. I mean, let's face it. Now, I think, perhaps we were heading in that direction a little bit. And then, Russia invaded Ukraine. And with that, Europe just, basically cowered and feared at the United States' feet, to the point where the US could go out and blow up Nord Stream and we wouldn't say anything about it. And I say we because I'm French. And so we missed an opportunity. And now what I think is going to happen with Trump is actually the odds are pretty high that you're going to get a deal between Trump and China. Because, again, Trump sort of needs a deal. He can't afford a new Cold War. So you get a deal with China, and, basically Europe ends up being the cuckold in the story, where, US and China go off in the sunshine, and Europe is left behind with no credibility, and, with China basically treating them as the cuckold that we are. That's my big fear. And I think we missed our appointment with destiny time and time again over the past decade.
I kind of agree. The key issue is what will be the consequences for the economy, for the social, cohesion, for the.
Well, I think the first consequence for me is that it completely decredibilizes the whole European construction exercise. Remember, when you and I are roughly the same age, we're from the same generation. Growing up, we were both told, if we build Europe, we'll be stronger together. We can, stand up to Russia, stand up to the US, stand up to China, stronger together, etc. And that's turned out to be a farce. We're actually weaker together. I think we have less credibility together. When I look at my own country of France, France today is a pygmy on the world stage. Germany is a pygmy on the world stage. Even Britain is a pygmy on the world stage relative to where we were 20 or 30 years ago before this whole European construction exercise started. So so that's, I think, and this is a realization that, people like you who study geopolitics have probably come to a while back. But this is a realization that every man in the street has now come to grasp with. And people realize I was sold a three-legged donkey with this European integration giving us more strength. It just isn't true, and it hasn't worked. So the first big question is I think you're going to have voters, whether in France or in Germany, that just say, you know what, this was bullshit, and I'm walking away from it now. Whether that means, Rassemblement National in France, AFD in Germany, or what we're seeing in Austria, what we're seeing in Sweden, in Holland. At some point, I think that, to be honest, the timer is on for Europe. Like, Europe's very purpose is no longer there, the whole European construction exercise. And we should just go back to, what it was initially, a free trade pact, and be done with it.
Yeah, but still, in the era of continentalization of macroeconomies, United States just trying to control the borders and imposing the tariffs, protectionist measures, China being a continent in itself, Russia being a huge country, India emerging, I mean,
So I think on the tariffs of the US, it'll be interesting because I think there is a possibility, like if we had this is why I smiled when you said European leaders. But I think what Xi Jinping is going to do when Trump says, if you got to do this, this, and this, he says, look, you do you and I do me. You want to put tariffs? You want to punish your consumers? Have at it. I don't care. Because the Chinese economy has spent the past 8 years basically cushioning themselves against US sanctions.
Yeah.
Like 8 years ago, they were surprised, but they've literally spent the past 8 years cushioning themselves. So now they're like, you know what? You want to do this? Have at it. You do you, I do me. Of course, in Europe, we're not ready for that, and nor do we have leaders with the guts to say, you know what, you do you, I do me. I'm going to do whatever's right for me.
Yeah. 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 Okay. So, sitting here in Poland, the conversation with you is not always the most funny in terms of the future.
No, but actually, Poland of all European countries is one of the best positioned, actually. Now you could say you're in a shitty neighborhood, you got a war at your border, and you've got obviously next to Russia and all that stuff. But Poland has the advantage of still having its own currency. It's got a dynamic economy. You've got you still have positive demographic growth. If you look at all the things, Poland has relative to other countries in Europe, like who's better positioned than Poland in Europe? It's a small list, if there's anybody on that list.
Let's cling to that assessment. Let's hope for the best. Thank you very much. Our guest today was 𝗏𝗏. Thank you for this. It's early morning in Warsaw. So all best regards to you back there in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thanks.